In Missouri, we are one of the few lucky states that have historical, recreational, and commercial paddlefish fisheries. Paddlefish provide unique fishing opportunities in our reservoirs and rivers across the state, but also maintain a commercial fishery in the Mississippi River as well. In order to maintain these fisheries, both the state and federal agencies are involved. On the state side, the Missouri Department of Conservation has an overall goal from the Paddlefish Management Plan, which is to maintain paddlefish statewide as a trophy sport fishery. Specifically, the goal is to have an average weight of those paddlefish harvested to be 30 pounds or more, and at least 20% of those harvested paddlefish to weigh 50 pounds or more. On the federal side, CITES, which is the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species, a branch of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, also requires state agencies to demonstrate sustainability of wild paddlefish stocks to allow the continued international trade of commercially harvested paddlefish and the roe. To evaluate if we're meeting our management goals and to answer CITES questions about sustainability, in 2012, we assessed basic demographic information for paddlefish populations within Missouri's rivers and reservoirs, which included the size structure, age, growth, and total annual mortality. However, the level of exploitation in each system was a crucial piece of information that was lacking. So in 2015, we started a long-term project to determine the exploitation rates and natural reproduction in Missouri's large rivers and reservoirs throughout the state. For the river portion of the project, the Mississippi River was the focus because it supports both recreational and commercial fisheries. But we also worked with regional fisheries management biologists to include other popular fisheries. And while we collected paddlefish that ranged in size from 6 to 48 inches in length, eye to fork, we tagged all those fish above 24 inches, which is the current minimum length limit, with jaw tags to estimate exploitation in each of these systems. Each jaw tag has a number for snaggers and commercial fishermen to call and report catching the tagged fish, just like a duck band, which you can see there on the lower left-hand corner. To develop our exploitation estimates, we used the number of jaw bands harvested divided by our reporting rate, and then that value was divided by the jaw bands available for harvest in each of these systems. As you can see in this table, for the Mississippi River, we estimated the average yearly exploitation as 2.5%. For the St. Francis River, it was 7.7%, and for the Black River, it was 26.3%. Keep in mind that these estimates are an average yearly exploitation estimate, and that the estimates were adjusted for tag loss and jaw bands not being reported. And while 2.5 and 7.7 are low, the 26.3 is reaching the threshold of concern. Typically, a 30% total annual mortality, which includes exploitation or fishing mortality with the addition of natural mortality, is concerning for a long-lived, late-maturing species like paddlefish. Some other results of the river portion of the study was that for the Mississippi River, we saw much more recreational harvest than we expected. It was actually at levels similar to that of the commercial harvest. And while the Mississippi River and St. Francis River had low annual exploitation estimates, we saw it was variable among years for all the systems. So we investigated the yearly variation in all systems a little closer. The graph on the right is just an example using commercial harvest data to show how closely exploitation and harvest is tied to how effectively gear can fish or fishermen can snag. During the study, both our ability to catch paddlefish as biologists and fishermen's ability to catch paddlefish was correlated to river levels. Another important piece of information needed to ensure sustainability is whether enough of the spawning stock is protected within these large rivers since they are not maintained through stocking. So while outsampling, all paddlefish over 24 inches were checked to determine whether they were male or female and if they had reached sexual maturity. Female paddlefish were not mature until 28 inches, and it wasn't until 32 inches that 41% of all females that were checked were mature, which means they either had the black eggs and were going to spawn this season, or had already spawned once and were already developing eggs for the next time that they would spawn. So our current length limit of 24 inches does not protect any of our spawning stock, while a minimum length limit of 32 inches would protect 41% of the females in the spawning stock. So what does this mean for current river paddlefish management? While exploitation appears low, current management approaches such as the 24-inch minimum length limit are not sufficient and do not support our current management objective of maintaining a self-sustaining population. It does not protect the immature paddlefish from being harvested before they can reproduce, and with any increase in harvest, it may not maintain a sustainable fishery. As for the commercial fishery on the Mississippi River, the Mississippi River Basin states are realizing that basin scale management is needed given the extreme migratory habits of paddlefish, which we saw in this tagging study. With fish being tagged in Missouri, were actually being caught in Iowa, Nebraska, Mississippi, Kentucky, Arkansas, and just about any state along the Mississippi River Basin. MICRA, which stands for the Mississippi Interstate Cooperative Resource Association, is potentially planning to propose a basin-wide minimum length limit throughout the lower Mississippi River Basin. For the reservoir portion of the project, we sampled all three large reservoirs, Harry S. Truman, Lake of the Ozarks, and Table Rock Lake. And we caught 9,128 paddlefish, which ranged in length from 14 to 50 inches and weighed from 1.5 pounds to 103 pounds. Only fish larger than the minimum length limit of 34 inches were tagged with jaw bands, which were called in by snaggers to help estimate reservoir-specific exploitation rates. Our reporting rates were quite high on all three reservoirs, ranging from 91 to 95%. The reservoir exploitation estimates were calculated the same way as the river, with the number of jaw bands harvested divided by our reporting rate, and then that value divided by the jaw bands available for each system. As you can see, the yearly average exploitation estimate was quite low for all three reservoirs at right around 8%. Some other interesting pieces of information we gained from the reservoir paddlefish work was realizing how far snaggers were traveling to come enjoy the Missouri resource. Of those snaggers that called and reported tags, they were from over 25 different states. We also documented paddlefish were getting through the dams and being caught in other reservoirs or rivers. For example, about 30% of the fish tagged in Truman were caught by snaggers in Lake of the Ozarks, and nearly 6% of those tagged in Lake of the Ozarks were caught either below Bagnell Dam or in other rivers. So what does all this mean for our current management goals on the reservoirs? We manage the reservoirs as a high-quality sport fishery. Specifically, the goal is to have an average weight of fish harvested to be 30 or more pounds. We used our sample to look at the average weight caught in each of the reservoirs, and of all the fish collected in our sample, 73% were 30 pounds or greater. The other specific goal is to have at least 20% of these fish that are harvested weigh 50 pounds or more, and of those fish that we collected in our sample, 17% were over 50 pounds. Table Rock was the only reservoir in which we actually sampled over 20%, which was 26% that were over 50 pounds. However, 17% is pretty close, so we're really close to meeting those goals. The other specific goal listed in the Paddlefish Management Plan is to have an average annual harvest of 3,000 fish per reservoir. To determine if we were meeting this goal, we used our tagging data to develop population estimates in Program Mark. All three reservoirs appear to be really close to the 3,000 fish being harvested each year based on our estimates for population and exploitation. While we appear to be meeting or nearly meeting the goals laid out in the Paddlefish Management Plan, some resource managers have begun to question whether the current regulations can maintain the goal of a trophy fishery if there is an increase in annual harvest in the future, due to an increased interest in snagging in general, an increased interest in trophy fishing, the evolving fishing methods, or those fishing for eggs. After the statewide 5-year study, it appears that the river fisheries are not meeting the goals laid out within the Paddlefish Management Plan. The reservoir fisheries are likely meeting the goals with current harvest rates, but the goals may need to be revised with perceived increases in harvest. Therefore, the first step would be to revise the Paddlefish Management Plan and update the goals to meet our current needs and objectives in our rivers and reservoirs. However, we do think that we can use some of the knowledge gained from this study to address some of the issues by making changes to our current regulations, and to do this, we gathered input from managers and protection staff to come up with some recommendations for both the commercial fishery and the recreational fishery. For the commercial fishery, the group came up with 2 recommendations for regulation consideration. The first is to increase the minimum length limit of 24 inches, which is currently the lowest among all commercial states, to a 32-inch minimum length limit, which would allow paddlefish to reproduce at least once before they can be harvested, which is important given that paddlefish in the Mississippi River are managed as a self-sustaining population and no stocking takes place. The second recommendation is to implement a harvest season, where currently Missouri has no harvest season, so that would align us with other commercial states and also reduce any unintentional mortality of paddlefish or bycatch due to high water temperatures. And it's also important to keep in mind that only limited harvest happens before or after the proposed season. For the recreational snag fishery, the group came up with 3 recommendations for regulation considerations. The first is to increase the current statewide minimum length limit on rivers from 24 to 32 inches. This would not change the current length limit of 34 inches in the reservoirs. This would only pertain to the rivers. The increased length limit would allow female paddlefish to reproduce before they can be harvested, making populations more sustainable. And also, it is thought that a higher length limit in some of these populations would result in increased size of fish available for harvest. If you look at the graph on the right, you can see that the 32-inch would allow many more fish to grow into those larger size classes. The second recommendation for regulation consideration proposed by the group was to define snagging in the Wildlife Code and add to the methods for clarification. The newly proposed snagging definition would be snag or snagging, the act of hooking or attempting to hook a fish in a part of the body other than the mouth or jaw by means of a pole, line, and hook. Snagging is characterized by repeated drawing or jerking motion of the pole, line, and hook, or by trolling with an unbaited hook rather than enticement by bait or lure. For the clarification, not more than 1 pole may be used by 1 person at any time to take or attempt to take a fish by snagging, snaring, or grabbing. The third recommendation for regulation consideration is to add Table Rock Lake to the regulation that no person shall continue to snag after taking a daily limit of 2 paddlefish. This regulation that prohibits snagging after 2 paddlefish have been harvested is already in effect on Truman Reservoir, Lake of the Ozarks, and their tributaries, as well as the Osage River. So this would just be adding Table Rock to the current regulation. So our next steps in this process is to update the MDC Paddlefish webpage with information from our 5-year study so that the public can be informed of the information that we have gained. And then we also would like to obtain public input regarding these potential regulation changes. In order to do this, we want to use our existing communication base. So we plan to engage our commercial fishermen who buy the Missouri roe harvester permits, and we would also like to engage those that receive the snagging report and those that have returned jaw bans the last 6 to 7 years so that we can get some public input. Overall, the proposed regulation changes will help the state reach our management goals on both the rivers and reservoirs and ensure we can meet the federal requirements as well.